I'm Jeff Garrison, pastor of Mayberry Bluemont Church, and we're here taping this sermon inside, but I want to invite you to come and we can be safe because we're worshiping outside through the 10th of October. So come and join us at 9 o'clock at Mayberry Church or at 10:30 at Bluemont. Do you know what a red herring is? Ever heard of them? It's a term that is often used in debate. When someone does not have a good argument, they throw out a red herring, which takes people's attention off the issue at hand. It distracts everyone. Politicians of all stripes use red herrings. But so do we. If you can't handle a situation, you just distract everybody around you. Sometimes we do that with our faith. We don't like something, so we start arguing theology, when we really should be showing the compassion of Jesus. Red herrings are nothing new. They were thrown around even in biblical times, as we're going to see in our passage in just a few minutes. Now, last week I finished up with the first half of the book of Daniel, and we're going to take a few weeks break from Daniel. We'll come back to it, but we're going to take a break from it and go into the Gospels. And today we're reading and looking at Mark, the 9th chapter, starting with the 14th verse. And this is where Jesus heals a boy who has been inflicted with an evil spirit. When they came to the disciples, as Jesus and Peter, James, and John, they've just come down from the Mount of Transfiguration. It says, when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and some scribes arguing with them. When the whole crowd saw him, they were immediately overcome with awe, and they ran forward to greet him. He asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" Someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought you my son. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak. And whenever it seizes him, it dashes him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they could do nothing, and they could not do so." He answered them, "You faithless generation, how much longer must I be among you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him. When the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell down on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. It has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you're able to do anything, have pity on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you are able, all things can be done for the one who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out, "I believe, help my unbelief." When Jesus saw that the crowd came running, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You spirit that keeps this boy from speaking and hearing, I command to you, come out of him and never enter him again." After crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he was able to stand. And when he entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind can only come out through prayer." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We're not told what people are arguing about in this passage, but everyone seems to be glad that Jesus has shown up. Overcome with awe, we're told. Perhaps as Jesus and the three disciples have just come back from the Mount of Transfiguration, there's some kind of glow that surrounds his face. Or perhaps they were just glad to have Jesus back there so he could settle their differences, so he could set things straight. Then Jesus asked, "What's going on here?" He doesn't get the answer we'd expect. I don't know why the disciples, the 9 who remained behind, didn't just lay it out for Jesus what was going on. I mean, they could have set forth both sides of the argument and let Jesus settle the issue. Or maybe they were just too embarrassed. Perhaps this is one of those all too frequent occasions where the real issue is something different from what the argument was about. This happens all the time. It happens especially in relationships. I mean, you argue about one thing when you're really mad about something else or upset about something else. What's at issue here is a possessed boy is driven into fits and is driving his parents insane. The boy needs help. And we're told that the disciples were unable to help this boy. They had failed. Now we're also told that there were some scribes there that was in this gathering and argument, and we might assume likewise they were unable to help this boy get better. I have a hunch what the argument is all about. I mean, since neither the disciples nor the scribes could help this boy, they distracted the crowd by debating theology. They argued over the nature of God, an important topic, I think we all agree. But while they were arguing, the kid is on the ground foaming at the mouth. In their highfalutin talk about God, they forget an essential trait of the Creator: compassion. Compassion. Since we've all been created in God's image, we've all been given a dose of it. Although it seems some of those gathered around this boy have lost some of theirs. I have a hunch while they suddenly get quiet when Jesus asks what's up, is that they know Jesus is going to see through their arguments and get to the real issue. This child in need. Jesus asked, "What's up?" While the disciples, the scribes, and the crowd remain silent, there's some man there in the back who speaks up. And he says, "I brought my son to your disciples. They could not rid his body of this demon, this spirit." The silence of the crowd and the plea of the Father focuses us on the real issue that's here at hand, the child. And Jesus is incensed. How much longer, he laments. How much longer do I have to put up with you? Clearly, Jesus is directing his anger at the disciples. In other words, at the ones who should have known better. You know, the ones like us, the disciples, the people that follow Jesus. Jesus then asks that the boy be brought to him. And when the demon inside his body sees Jesus, he goes berserk. Even demons believe and tremble, we're told. The demon throws a child into a violent fit. The healing stories of Jesus, though, are always more than just a demonstration of brute power over illness and evil. I mean, if Jesus had only wanted to demonstrate his power, all thing he would have had to say is, get ye gone, ye demon. And the freed boy would be able to run home to his mama and tell him all that happened. But instead, Jesus is also using this moment as an opportunity to teach. So as the boy shakes uncontrollably, Jesus gets to what's going on here. He asks the father, how long has the boy been like this? And the father, whom we now see as desperate, tells Jesus that the boy's been like this since childhood. That this demon has continually tried to destroy the boy by throwing him into fire and trying to drown him in water. That this demon is a perfect example of evil, because the goal of evil is always destruction and death. Now, Mark's a short gospel. He tends to be brief on details. So indulge me for a moment. Let me tell you what I think the father said while asking Jesus to take pity on the boy. Our boy's possessed. He's destroyed our living room. He's broken the lamps and the tables and the chairs. He broke the trinkets my wife purchased on our honeymoon. The child is the terror of the neighborhood. All the kids, stay away. None of them will play with him. I mean, even dogs, even mean junkyard dogs run in fear from this kid. Our son has problems. So if you can do something, please do it, he asked. And the request takes Jesus back. If I am able? If I am able? Sure, I'm able. All things are possible with faith. And I wonder if the man's faith had been challenged by the disciples' inability to help this boy. After all, he obviously had heard about, his father had obviously heard about Jesus and the 12 and felt that if he could just get his son to see Jesus, things would be better. But then it didn't happen. Jesus was gone. He was up on the mountain. But he thought then, well, maybe, the disciples, they should have the same power as their master, so maybe they could help. He assumed, though, they could, but they couldn't. So now he's down to his last straw. He sees Jesus himself. And he thinks maybe Jesus can help. But there's also some doubt. He's been disappointed before, so there's still doubt in his mind. But maybe not. Maybe not. So I better not set my hopes too high. When Jesus tells him that all things are possible for the one who believes, then he cries out, I believe, help my unbelief. It's a cry of desperation. It's also the climax of the story. He believes. And he believes only because he has no other option. He believes, but he still has doubts. And if we're honest, most of us would acknowledge that we've been there too. We can identify with the man's feelings. We know Jesus is the answer, but we don't want to trust him enough to throw all of our concerns on him. Consider the lilies of the field and the birds of the air, Jesus tells us. But we're quick to remind Jesus that we're neither flowers nor birds, but people, human beings, Homo sapiens, the crown of creation. We're people with jobs and homes and mortgages and car payments and kids with whom we have a hard time at relating. Like I said, we identify with this man. We believe, but only to a certain point. We believe, but not fully. We want to keep some of that control for ourselves. We don't want to just let it all go. And that's generally where we get in trouble. Harold was a man who started mysteriously attending a church that I served early in my ministry in New York State. A tall, broad-shouldered man, a farmer and a truck driver who wore overalls and flannel shirts. He was also quiet and shy. When he first started coming to church, he would always sit in the back and he would slip out during the last hymn. I mean, it was a month before I got to shake his big calloused hands. And it was another month before we had a chance to talk. But this was a small town. Everybody knew everybody else and everybody's business. And people were beginning to question me, even on the street. Well, he's coming to your church? He's coming to church? Harold's in church? Even people that didn't attend our church had heard and was wondering what's up, because he was seen as kind of a rough guy and a loner. But I was also, somebody shared with me that they thought he was in trouble with the law. They also told me his family had never attended church, as long as, none of them from what they knew. And I was also warned to be careful around him, because although he was kind of quiet and shy, he was prone at times to violence. So when I finally got a chance to meet with Harold one-on-one, this big hunk of a man sitting in front of me broke down and cried. He bawled as he explained all of his troubles. A particular thing had started. He had a son in his early 20s who was wanted by the law for traffic violations. And it seemed the boy liked to outrun the sheriff deputies, which did not exactly endear him to the officers. So one night, 2 deputies came to Harold's house about 2 o'clock in the morning. And according to his story, Harold asked them for a search warrant. And they were kind of antsy and said they didn't need one, that they were in hot pursuit for his son. And they pushed their way into the door, into his house, and Harold, who was this big hunk of man, did what came naturally. He decked the first officer, busting his nose. Well, that didn't last long, because they pulled their guns and their nightclubs, billy clubs or whatever, and they quickly beat up and subdued Harold and hauled him off to jail. But Harold was vindicated. I mean, it turned out they did need a search warrant, and it wasn't exactly in a hot pursuit. But the court fights and the time in jail took a lot out of him. He lost his life savings. He was in danger of losing his farm. Like the man in our story this morning, Harold didn't know what to do. And there seemed to be nowhere else for this man, almost 60 years old, for him to turn. So putting his trust in Jesus became this desperate attempt to regain sanity for a man who had no other options. But it worked. I mean, to the surprise of the entire community, Harold asked to be baptized. That was the first time I saw him in a suit, was the day that he was baptized. He turned his life around. And for a man who had been a loner for his whole life, he began to develop friends. And with his legal problems behind him, a few years after I had left New York for Utah, I was surprised to learn that he was actually serving that church as an officer. I believe. Help my unbelief. This is an honest statement of our human condition. The ability to say, I believe, comes from the grace of God, the grace that God gives us to seek Him out. And the cry, help my unbelief, is a very natural call or natural prayer of confession, one that demonstrates to God our dependence, not on ourselves, but on Him. Our dependence on Jesus. To say, I believe, isn't enough. We can all say, I believe, and still believe something that we do by ourselves. Or that belief is something that we do by ourselves. But when we say, help my unbelief, we admit our need and our dependence upon God. It's difficult to admit, but we can't do it alone. Therefore, Jesus, at the end of this passage, when He's got the disciples by themselves and they ask Him, well, why couldn't we do this? Why couldn't we help this man? How couldn't we get rid of this evil spirit in this boy? Jesus tells the disciples that this kind of demon can only be driven out by prayer. Another way of saying this, I think, is that overcoming the powers of evil is not something that we do ourselves. And we can see in Harold's case where his attempt to take things in his own hands got him. It's only by depending upon God can we truly be successful in this life and in eternity. This passage reminds us that we're not God. We're not the Lord. We don't run the company, and we're not the CEO. Jesus is. And we're here to do His work. But we must depend on Him and on His power as we listen to the cries of those in pain, those who have the blues, like the man in this story and like Harold. We listen to them and we reach out to them with compassion and love. Amen.